Welcome to Write Now Workshop Podcast, where you can write a book and change the world. I'm your host, Kitty Bucholtz, and this is episode 240, Reaching Out with Deep Emotion, an interview with Cynthia Ruchti, coming to you on Thursday, March 18th, 2021. I just had the most amazing conversation with Cynthia. This woman can write deep, strong, gut-wrenching emotion like no one I know. And she hasn't done it just once. She's got over 30 books out, fiction and nonfiction, over 40 awards. And I'm just like, yes, please tell me how can I write books that have such amazing emotion? I mean, I was reading her newest book, Facing the Dawn, asking myself, you can't ask her in the interview, has this happened to you? Because that might turn out to be quite rude or just difficult or painful if it were true. But no, okay. We'll just let her talk about how she did it and that sort of thing. But let me just say, wow, because as we know, in writing, in communicating through story in any way with people, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, speaking to a group or doing something that's just on paper, all of the different ways that we communicate, we touch people by touching their emotions. We help people by helping them understand that we get how it feels to be in that space and we want to help them genuinely. And whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, if people can read your work and think, oh my gosh, someone gets how I feel, that's an amazing thing to make someone not feel like they're the only one. You know how it feels when you're like, oh, thank goodness I'm not the only one who thinks that, feels that, does that. It's just like, oh, such a feeling of relief. Because we don't live in nomadic tribes anymore, mostly, I think we're looking for ways that we can belong. Oh, this weird thing about me, I'm not an outsider. There is a tribe that I wasn't sure, only hoped existed. And within this tribe, we all do or think or feel this one really weird thing, or at least it feels weird to me right now. But now that I realize other people feel that way, then maybe it doesn't feel so weird, which makes me feel a whole lot better. And that's what we can do with our writing. And Cynthia obviously has done a great job with her writing in that regard. Now, let me just tell you something to look out for in the interview. Cynthia also mentions when she was first looking to publish her first book, and she's going to writers' conferences, she's meeting people, I think she said she was taking classes. So she's looking for ways to improve her work and get it out into the world so that it becomes a published book that people can read. And then someone gave her some advice that was really difficult. And I think that she says in the interview, if she hadn't taken that advice, she's not sure that she would be published, certainly wouldn't be published with that book. And I want you to listen and pay attention to the advice that they gave her because it rocked my world too. And I'm still thinking to myself, wow, how can I take that advice? That's tough. I really want to do it, but it will be also kind of scary. But it would be worth it, right? I mean, if you wrote books that changed other people's hearts and minds and maybe even lives, that would be totally worth the time we spend. And I go on and on about this because it's true. And I'm not sure that you have enough people telling you this in your life. The books that you're writing can change people's lives, if only for a moment while they get a moment of peace after a really long, tough day, or because it changes the way that they think about something. Think of some of your favorite writing books. Think of your favorite one. How did it change you? How did it change you as a writer? And how did it change what you wrote? So no matter what you're writing, fiction or nonfiction or speeches or whatever, plays, screenplays, songs, musicals, whatever you're writing, it might be just the right thing for the right people at the right time. And so it is worth your time to do it. I had one client who is 88 years old, and I helped him self-publish his very first book, a thriller. And he was so excited. He's got more books in the works, more books coming out. And I just could not be happier working with him. He was so excited to get his work out there into the world and then learn how to figure out how to get people to know that it was there and buy it and read it. And it was so much fun working with him. Somebody else that I worked with was in their 30s and they wanted to write a nonfiction book that had to do with the work that they do on an everyday basis, but to make it particularly appealing. And they were a really good speaker. They are a really good speaker and a really good writer. And I helped this fellow finish the book that he had inside him, but he wasn't exactly sure how to pull out, and then self-publish the book. And those are the two things that I do. I help people finish their books and I help people publish their books. Now, I'm not a publisher myself, so I can only give advice on if you want to use a traditional publisher. And a lot of times the first step is find the right agent for you. And of course, that has sub steps too. But the two things that I do coaching wise is I help people finish your book and I help people self-publish your book. Those are the names of the two programs. Now, regardless of whether or not you need help doing one of those two things right now, I do want you to always be looking for and finding encouragement in this show. Otherwise, this is a waste of my time. If I'm not changing your world, I'm wasting both of our time. And that is what I want you to stop thinking about, that your writing might be wasting your time. It is not. Your writing is not a waste of your time, regardless of how long you get to spend doing it each week, whether if it's 60 hours a week or 1 hour a week, it is not wasting your time. And it's very important that you believe in yourself and believe in your work and be looking for ways that you can make better creations and that you finish them and get them out in front of people. Even if you're writing a book that's just for your family and you're not planning on publishing it, as far as to make sales and to make money, that is important. When I think of all the stories that I only heard once growing up, and now my parents and my grandparents are dead, I can't be reminded of those stories anymore. They're just gone. Imagine how awesome it would be if someone in your family wrote down all the stories while people were still around to remember them and pass them on to the next generation. I just had a great niece. Is that right? My nephew just had a daughter. No, sorry. Yes, that is true. One nephew had a daughter and one nephew had a son, just very, very, very recently. And these people will never hear my grandfather's funny tales about how he knew it was time to go home and get married to my grandmother because of something his soon-to-be father-in-law said to him. And it's just the funniest little thing. And it's like a 5-minute story. And yet I've got to try to remember to tell these kids this funny story of their great grandfather. Yeah, no, two greats, because it connects you. So whatever it is that you're writing, keep going, finish it. If you need help, reach out to me. Go to Right Now Workshop/writing coach. See what sorts of things that I can do for you. If I can get on a call with you and even help you to figure out what your next step is, great. If I can't actually help you with one of my programs, I can at least point you in some good directions. So just keep going. Just keep going. And if you need some help, go to my website. There's a place there that you can fill out a form so that you can contact me, or just email me at kitty@kittybucholtz.com, because I do want to help you. What if you're one of the people who changes the whole world? What if you wrote a book that somehow um, brought brought us closer to world peace, brought us closer to protecting our planet so that it's around for a few more generations, so that my great niece and great nephew have great grandchildren too, who have food to eat and air to breathe. And yours, obviously, you have tons of people. Okay, I'm just going to stop because sometimes I just get so excited about the things that I'm really passionate about and I want to share them. And then I sort of forget sometimes when to stop. So I'll stop. But there you go. Please be encouraged. Keep going. Listen to this episode. Listen to what Cynthia says is the best writing advice that she got that helped her publish her first book. And we're talking about a woman who has more writing awards than she even has books out. That's amazing. Listen to her. Okay, I'm going to step down off of the heart on my sleeve box and let's listen to Cynthia tell her story about writing, and have a great writing week yourself. Today's guest is Cynthia Ruchti. Cynthia is the award-winning author of more than 30 books, including the novels Afraid of the Light, Miles from Where We Started, They Almost Always Come Home, and her new book, Facing the Dawn. Her books have been honored with more than 40 readers, reviewers, and retailers awards, including Romantic Times Inspirational Novel of the Year, 4 Selah Awards, and 5 Christian Retailing's Best Awards. She has also been a finalist for many others, including the Carol and the Christie. Former president of and current professional relations liaison for American Christian fiction writers, Cynthia lives in Wisconsin. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you so much, Kitty. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you too. I've been emailing with you back and forth a little bit. Turns out we have mutual friends.
Yes.
And plus, I'm from Michigan. So you being from Wisconsin, it's like we're neighbors.
Like we're neighbors, practically. Yes.
Practically, with
when
big body of water.
When we always say when we're done with the weather, we send it on to Michigan.
Yes. It's so funny because now that I live in Malmö, Sweden, I have some friends who live in London, and every once in a while I'll be like, so it's snowing here. Did you have snow 2 days ago? And they're like, yeah, but we have sun now. So you should have sun in 2 days.
We love that. Love that.
It's fun. You know what's really weird to me? I've lived in Michigan my whole life. I was born in Indiana, then Chicago. By the time I was 5, we moved to Michigan, and I lived there until John and I got married, and we moved away when we were 25. I had never in my life heard of or eaten cheese curds until I was in my 40s.
Oh, what a loss.
I know.
40 years when you could have been eating cheese curds.
Yes. I went to Chicago and my friend was like, you've never had cheese curds? How is that even possible? I'm like, I don't know. Is it good? She's like, oh my gosh. And we had cheese curds like 3 times while I was there for a weekend.
It's our state food.
It's oh my gosh, I should move to Wisconsin, but I'm afraid that the problem I'm having with my clothes right now would only get worse.
Yes, that is true. Cheese curds, for those who don't know, are just they're like the freshest cheese you can possibly imagine. And they squeak when you bite into them, which may sound disgusting, but if they've been in the fridge at all, if you put them in the microwave for about 5 seconds, they come back to that ooey gooey squeaky loveliness. So there's the tip for the day for food.
And I definitely was thinking to myself, I've got to put these in a book somewhere.
Oh yeah. Yes. I'd said it just like I would have from Wisconsin. Yep. True.
Well, listen, there's 1,000 things to talk about. You and I have also talked about, what should we talk about? Well, we're definitely going to have you on the show again, and we haven't even started.
Yep.
But we want to talk about your new book, which at the time that people are listening to this has just recently been released. Yay! Oh, if you're not watching,
yeah. I don't have a book cover, but it's Facing the Dawn from Revell, and yes, fresh off the press, as they say, or hot off the press.
Nice. Awesome. Now, I personally, you know what? I want to talk about the book, but let's just talk about how did you get started? You've been in the business a really long time and from all sorts of different angles. So just give us the nickel tour.
The nickel tour. Oh dear. I actually thought I was going to work in the chemistry laboratory for my life's work, and that would be the supplement to a wife and a mom, homemaker. And I was in the chemistry lab and wanted to be home with the kids. So after about 7 years of that, we made that really hard decision to go to one income, but I wanted to keep my mind active too when I was making these fabulous birthday parties and cleaning up messes and things. So I took some correspondence courses in writing. The last assignment for the last course was to create a radio script for a 15-minute radio broadcast. And I had no interest in that whatsoever. I thought newspaper articles, magazine articles, that sounds good. Maybe a book someday. But writing for radio, I had no interest. I hadn't even heard of a 15-minute program before. What was that going to be like? So I set it aside for maybe 8 or 9 months. I don't know if any of your listeners ever procrastinate, but I did. And at the end of that time, I took out that assignment and filled it out just because wanted to get my certificate and be done with the course and couldn't until I did that assignment. Within about 2 weeks of getting that certificate that said I had completed the course, and that last assignment I passed, but it wasn't my best work. I had an opportunity to meet a woman who had just been given, this is not a joke, 15 minutes of free airtime on a radio station halfway across the country from me. And we were together for 4 days doing a ministry project together. And at the end of the 4 days, I thought that she might take a couple of the ideas that I had tossed out to her, but I certainly had no experience or anything. But at the end of our time together, she handed me the business card for the station and said, "Send the first program here." And that was the beginning of this. And I thought, I have no equipment. I really have no experience. I didn't even really have interest in it. But that led to a stint of 33 years on the radio with this broadcast that was to help with the spiritual and faith needs of stay-at-home moms, which then wound up ministering to pastors too. And we had farmers riding their tractors, listening to the broadcast. It was much more wide ranging than we ever would have imagined. And it at one time was reaching 48 stations across the United States, and
Wow.
then abroad as well, as soon as the internet came into play and they could do live streaming, the radio stations could do live streaming. So what a ride. And as we got, my radio partner was my neighbor lady who was really good with the red pen. So I would write the scripts, she would edit them, and then the two of us were the on-air voices for this. First 8 minutes or so was a scripted scene from everyday life. And then we would have a musical interlude and some devotional thoughts or some kind of teaching, some kind of helpful tip or point to help us navigate life. And that meant that I was writing fiction and nonfiction all the time for all
Right.
those 33 years. At the end of the run of that, it was on Monday through Friday, every single day. And it was a lot of work, but we loved it by that time. We knew that it was where we were supposed to be. But my neighbor lady was 22 years older than I was. Her husband had taken ill, so we knew it was time to retire the broadcast. And I had, a few years before that, started to investigate what would it take. I've been writing for 33 years professionally. What would it take to write a novel or a whole book, a whole nonfiction book? So I went to writers' conferences, which is one of my key things that I recommend, is whether virtual or in person, to get yourself to a writers' conference. Went to plenty of those, found out how much I didn't know, and began to study and read. And eventually then, it was 2010 when my first novel released, They Almost Always Come Home. And that had been, I can't do the math really well at this hour, but that had been like decades that I'd been writing professionally before I had my first book
Wow.
traditionally published.
Wow. That's amazing.
That was not a nickel variety of but how do you tell that story? And
Yeah.
usually it takes 4 hours to tell. I thought I did pretty well.
I think so too. Yeah. So this is how I was a chemist and a mom and became a radio show host.
Yeah, it's a natural path, don't you think? It's
Right.
just
I think that
easy
everybody could try
transitions.
it. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Wow. Okay. So you'd been doing this radio show, doing lots of writing then every week,
Mhm.
and then decided to write a book, got your first book traditionally published, knew that the radio show was ending, and then decided, wow, this book writing thing is amazing. This is my thing. My next thing.
My next thing, I think that's a great way to put it, Kitty, because I had I was content with the radio writing, but I had no idea that all those years were really preparation for his next step. I needed to be faithful with what I was doing. I needed to hone my skills, hone the craft, figure out punctuation, and this was interesting and might be interesting to some writers too, that I had learned to write for the ear all those
Right.
years. And that then made a difference in the way that I wrote for the printed page, because I loved how words sounded to the ear. I had to pay attention to the rhythm. I had to pay attention to, if I have no he said, she said, will people still know who's speaking?
Right.
If we had no setup of the setting, is the reader or the listener still going to be engaged in what's being put down on the paper? So all of that was not just practice, but preparation for
Yeah.
what the next stage would be. And that's something too, I think, that might encourage people, is we often get in our heads, I want to write novels. Maybe there's another angle. Maybe your storytelling efforts are best used in nonfiction. Or maybe your gift is to tell somebody else's story, not your own, to come alongside them and tell someone else's story. Or maybe you are the kind of writer who writes best in a 3-minute stint of something that can be read quickly. And there's no shame in that,
Yeah.
because having your name on a book is not the epitome of writing success. Reaching and touching readers' hearts is the epitome of success.
Yes, yes. I love that. And that's a good point. There's so many parts of our lives that I don't know if it's me or if it's humans. I haven't in all of the many books that I love to read on neuroscience, I haven't actually come across this idea, whether or not we all compartmentalize our life or if it's just something that some people do. But I cannot tell you the number of times that somebody's like, "Oh my gosh, that's an amazing, crazy story about that thing that happened to you when you were 18. You should write that." And then I go, "Oh, I never thought of that." Like,
Yeah.
I'm so used to writing fiction, stories that I just make up
Mhm.
in my head that I forget to even ask myself whether or not something else interesting has happened. And so there's so many other things that, like, you got into the radio show, I imagine partially at least because you were a mom and the show was for moms.
Mhm.
So you had the experience. So I guess there's a lot of things in our lives we could be asking ourselves, is there some interesting place that I could put this? Even the
Mhm.
chemistry. I mean, I
Mhm.
have a different friend who used to be a biochemist, and then she ended up writing dystopian fiction. So she would use her biochemistry to create these crazy ways that how the world would end.
Everything we're experiencing in life is just fodder for what we write.
Yes.
And sometimes it doesn't come back into our writing until many, many years later, but we do. We file it away. We file away not just what happened, but how we felt when it happened.
Yeah.
We file away the whole concept of how people around us are reacting. What's the world like? What are we remember tastes and smells and and all of that gets put into that file folder that blossoms and balloons in a writer's mind. And sometimes they'll come back in a very direct way in our writing. Sometimes we don't even realize, oh, that's from that moment when I sat in grandma's kitchen and she gave me the last cinnamon roll. And where we realized that just came out in a nonfiction book 40 years later or something. But the emotional part of it, how things make us feel, was really key in the first novel that I ever had published, which is They Almost Always Come Home. I'd been writing novels for a while. Written novellas. I had maybe 3 or 4 that I considered complete, but they were going nowhere with editors and publishing houses. I didn't have an agent at the time, but my heart was open. I had the sense that I needed to keep being brave. And there was someone at a writers conference who had suggested, write the book that will cost you the most emotionally to write.
Wow.
And I considered the thought. It made me think, I don't think I have a book like that. No, I don't think, oh, maybe I do. And I recalled that a few years earlier, my husband almost didn't come home from his canoe trip to Canada. He
Wow.
got deathly ill up in the wilderness, far away from anything, was 5 days lying in his tent, unable to communicate with anybody, except when a passing canoeist would come by. Our 21-year-old son was with him at the time, and our son would send little notes with any canoeist that passed by. They were still 2 days away from the ranger station if the winds were right. So in the end, he eventually was within about an hour of death when the float plane was finally able to land and pick him up and take him to a hospital. He was in the ICU for some time. And even then, we weren't sure he was going to make it. He
Wow.
did. He
Yeah.
came back to me, but then it made me think of all that just cesspool of emotions that came with that experience. And I began to do what a writer does, all the what ifs. What if there was a woman who wasn't at all sure she wanted her husband to come home? And what would have made her feel that way in an otherwise reasonable marriage? What could that have been like? And that experimenting with the what ifs led to the book that eventually became the first book that got published. So
Wow.
maybe there's a writer out there who's thinking, this, the deep emotional connection to, and what they've been trying to express in nonfiction, they might look at that and realize, I've been leaving emotion out of this. What if I let the emotion show up on the page? Would that blog post or that nonfiction book or that magazine article look like if I let emotion show up on the page and
Yeah.
I let myself go back to remember something either from my past or from walking alongside someone else?
Wow. That's amazing because so here's the funny thing. And it's sometimes I feel like I should be a little bit embarrassed. And I'm like, there are too many writers and too many books in the world, and life is too short. There's no way I could have possibly read everything. So I haven't read your books before, any of your work before. And in general, I read a lot of rom-com, romantic
Mhm.
comedies, and a lot of supernatural suspense that, borders on horror. I don't know why. Those are two of my favorite genres.
You people always surprise me.
So I'm reading your book and I'm thinking, I can't go to sleep now. I mean, like, this woman is so torn up. How could all these bad things and more bad things happen and more bad things?
Mm.
And I'm like, okay, I can't read this right before I go to sleep. And then I'm thinking, how in the world, like, what is it that you write? The question, I guess, is sort of like, what do you think that you're pulling out of yourself? And are all of your books like so intense? I mean, it is emotionally
Mhm.
intense. It's great. But I would be reading it and sometimes think, I don't know how I could ever come up with a story that had like this much intensity to it. So tell us a little bit about, I don't know, your process or what you are drawn to in a story.
That's a great, great question, Kitty, because you you can't just fake it, but imagination does definitely come into play. So wherever we get our ideas from, and writers' brains are unique, we know that, but wherever we get our ideas from and wherever we start going with them, I know there are author friends of mine who write completely different kinds of stories than I do. This is the place where I feel like I've hit my stride, or this is my sweet spot. Can I write a rom-com? Yep. I do at Christmas time. Sometimes I
Nice.
love rom-coms that are centered around Christmas and love delving into that. But my primary place is, and even when I write nonfiction, I think about this nonfiction book I'm writing is the book I want to hand to the characters in my novel. This is the book they need to read.
Yeah.
But but I but because there are other authors who don't go to that place where it's the intensity as you described, or they're tough topics, and my goal is to handle tough topics in a tender way,
Ah,
and so that the reader is always left with hope, so that hope shows up throughout, threaded throughout, not necessarily just at the end in the last chapter, but feeling the real and sometimes very raw emotions. And it's not all that different from the horror or thriller,
Yeah.
where what the writer wants is for the reader to feel scared or tense. And in this place, I want the reader to feel what the character's going through.
Yeah.
And even when it's hard. And sometimes people would say, well, why would I want to pick up a book that has grief in it and loss in it? Well, because you probably have had grief or loss. And if you haven't, which would be rare, the people around you have. So one of my key thoughts is I would love my readers to walk away from my books feeling like they had learned something about themselves and they had learned something about the people around them.
Yeah.
And not just in a not certainly not in a teaching way. Maybe I should word it better this way. They have felt something about themselves and they have
Yeah.
felt something about the people around them.
I like that. That's really good because the whole book, I'm definitely feeling it you know, part of me is still the reader going, holy cow, this woman's had the worst couple of years.
Yeah.
Um,
Life hasn't been good to her.
yeah, no. But then there's these other things that happen in the secondary characters that come in, and you know, it's so funny the way that she started calling her best friend that she hasn't seen forever, her
Mhm.
forever friend, because I'm
Mhm.
like, oh wow, I haven't heard I haven't heard any adult describe their friends that way. Mostly you hear forever homes for adoptable pets. You know,
Mhm.
we're looking for his forever home,
Mhm.
or kids saying, you know, my
Mhm.
BFF.
Mhm.
But I loved the way that you like delved into the relationships that women have with each other and
Mhm.
how very realistic it is that sometimes you're like, okay, you are 30 seconds away from getting punched. You better back down, you know? And yet you needed your friend, whether you wanted to admit it or not, to
Mhm.
push you, you know, just that much, a little bit more, or
Mhm.
it was, I love the best friends.
I if they were that relationship was among my favorites too in the book as I was writing Facing the Dawn. And there was a spark to that as well. Just as I'm in the middle of writing and I'm just figuring out who are those additional characters that are going to be important to this story, because initially it looked like the main character, Mara, was completely alone. She had no place to turn, nobody to lean on, as one thing after another kind of piled onto her, which I don't think is as unreasonable for people to imagine as it
Yeah.
might have been even a few years ago, but one thing after another. And in the process of writing the book and thinking through the characters, I reconnected with one of my forever friends. We had known each other since we were probably first, second, third grade, or second, third, fourth grade, something like that. And our families were very close. We were dear, dear friends. We saw each other very infrequently. And then over the years, after we grew up and got married, each of us, and got into our professions and working with our families, never, ever, ever, ever saw each other. So rare. We would send Christmas cards back and forth. When more people were writing long letters back in the old days, we did for a while. And then life, of course, consumed us. And it was the Christmas cards. Then the era came when she was writing the Christmas cards to me, and I had to let Christmas cards go on my list of to-dos, but she was so faithful. And every time she would sign a letter or a Christmas card, your forever friend, Cheryl.
Aw.
So as I'm writing this book, noticed each other on Facebook, and we said, why can't we have a Zoom conversation? So we did, after many, many years of not seeing each other face to face. Spent 2 hours just catching up and watching how our paths had crossed in experiences far more closely than we ever would have dreamed, way beyond what you can put in a Christmas letter or a small note. And the heart connection with that forever friend was so strong. And I thought, I've had several people like that in my life. They are so rare and beautiful and precious to us. I need to have a forever friend in this story. And that wound up being part of the main thrust of why those characters were in there.
Wow.
And then brand new friends who come along quickly beside us. That happens too. And sometimes just clear out of the blue, those friends that come alongside us quickly. So I enjoyed exploring that part of the story as well. And again, that relationship isn't always perfect. It has its own flaws, but being able to count on someone who is always faithful, just steady as a rock, and what it's like to be able to hang onto a rock when you're going through a rocky spot in your life.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Now, for someone like me, I met my husband, John, when I was 19. We've been married 30 years. And I was realizing when I was preparing for the interview with you, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I need to ask this question because the heroine in my current novel is a new young widow with two
Mhm.
children. And I haven't been thinking too much about because it's a romantic comedy. I need it to
Aha.
not be but I also need for the moments that are the moments that she cries
Mm,
or whatever happens, I need that to feel totally realistic.
mm.
So I have no idea whether or not you have experiences like any of the characters in your books, but what do you suggest to writers when they need to go into an emotional place that they've never been, but it's important to the story that this feel authentic? What are
Mhm.
some of the ideas that you have for that?
There are oftentimes there are three, maybe more than that, but three probably places that we can get that kind of education. One of them is obviously from the things we've experienced ourselves. I felt that I'd been given as one of, if a writer is going to write for a long time, they have to believe that they've been given a gift that not everybody has. That there may oftentimes people will come and say, wow, you could express that thing that I felt, but I wasn't able to express. And that's kind of what we're fed by when we move
Yeah.
forward. Okay, apparently not everybody thinks this way or feels this way. So I will be a writer. And as we're going through, so oftentimes it is those things we get a flash of what it was. I get a flash of what it was like to sit at my mother's bedside when she was dying, or my grandfather. I get a flash of when a child or a grandchild was sick or going through a really traumatic place emotionally or mentally. I feel what I felt. I've watched my friends, but I've watched with a listening ear, a true listening ear. And I think writers will do themselves a great favor if they don't just use their eyes as a sense, but they use also the connection with empathy with those around them. And if you don't have a gift of empathy, maybe ask for it or develop it or exercise it or work on it, because that gift of empathy is going to really help the writing that you do. Sometimes I get it from how I feel when I'm watching a movie or reading somebody else's book. And I
Yeah.
notice what they leave out. And that's sometimes the most poignant part. Or I noticed that it was a glance, it wasn't words, or it was an intake, that sharp intake of breath, and that's what communicated what was happening emotionally. So we draw from a lot of different places. It's something that's hard to teach. It's almost something that you have to be willing to sit down to the table and
Yeah.
collect other people's emotions in order to be able to write authentically about it, because we can make up all kinds of things about what that must feel like or what it must have been like, or that she was crying all the time. No, typically we go about our lives, we may be sarcastic about what we're trying to deal with, and then boom, we're hit with that wave of grief again.
Yeah.
And that's a tale that almost everybody tells when they've been through a season like that. So you're writing a rom-com with a new widow. It's going to be very interesting because there will be comedy in it and there will be rom in it. There will be romance in it. But And as a new widow, she's probably resisting the romance initially because she's a new widow. And
Yeah.
it seems dishonoring for her to consider any other person when she's lost this person, whether she loved him deeply or she loved him surfacely.
Right.
So all kinds of those resources of where do we draw from to write authentically about it. But our goal really should always be writing authentically, not what might be considered traditionally or in a canned way.
Yes, yes. And I like your idea. You said you didn't think it was probably something that you could teach people to write this way, but I think what you gave us is teaching us how to listen and watch and hear so that we can collect these experiences, like
Mhm.
even from other people. I can't think of who it was. It was somebody that I know, so not a stranger. Um, and it was on camera. So it was sometime in this last year that we've been having, everybody at home and doing Zoom. And I remember the person, it was a man speaking about something that had, emotional significance to him. And he was speaking just normally speaking. And then he just paused in the middle of a sentence and he looked down at his notes, and it was just a long enough pause for you to start getting uncomfortable. And if you were looking away, you were looking at the screen now going, what's going on? Why is he pausing? And then he cleared his throat. And there was another little bit of a pause, and then he kept on going. And then I almost started to cry because I was like, oh my
Oh,
gosh, he's trying not to cry. I was
oh,
like, oh my. And then,
mm,
yeah, my writer brain was like, oh, remember that. This is how
mm,
men like show that they're
mhm,
trying not to cry, as opposed to, it wouldn't be to show a woman whose chin quivers where she's trying not to cry
mhm.
sounds normal to me. But to say that a man did that, that would not sound normal to me. So collecting these experiences is part of what you're talking about, and then drawing from them later.
Right. And I think you brought up something very interesting, that the personality, not just the gender, but the personality of the person will make a big difference as well. Some people intentionally use humor to pass off what is a very deep feeling. They don't want to linger in that deep feeling anymore or very long. So they use humor, but the tuned in listening ear is going to see what's behind that. And some others are stoic. They are going, oh,
Right.
this happened to me. That's too bad. Here we go. We're moving on. We're pressing
Yeah.
on. But with them as well, almost 100% of the time, there's going to be that wave that hits them, sometimes in a very inappropriate moment or in a very unexpected way. I remember after my mother passed away, she had had congestive heart failure for a long, long, long time. And even when she was in a residence facility for the end of her life, the meals that they could prepare for her still had too much salt in it, even though they were low salt meals.
Oh,
So I would make her meals for her and take them to the residence facility, and walking up and down the grocery store aisles all the time looking for what is something that has absolutely no salt in it or is like low, 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 low salt.
yeah.
And probably a month after she passed away, and she passed away in many ways with a smile on her face because she had lived a long, long life and lived far longer than anybody expected she would. I was walking down the aisles of the grocery store and I reached for a can of something that I was surprised and happy to see it had absolutely no salt in it. And then realized in that moment, I don't need this anymore. And
Yeah.
that wave came over me of my mom is gone and I won't see her again on this earth. And so, like a can of soup can be a trigger for
Yeah.
grief. Our witnessing that in others or feeling that in ourselves is what helps us write it into our stories.
Brilliant. And it was interesting what you said. And I think that in Lisa Cron's new book, Lisa Cron wrote Wired for Story and Story
Mm,
Genius. And she was on the show a couple of weeks ago. By the time this airs, it will have been a couple of weeks ago, talking about her new book, Story or Die. And it's less for writers and more for people just navigating life,
mm,
business people trying to figure out how to speak and connect to their customers. But one of the things that she mentions in the book is that story helps us learn empathy.
mm. Absolutely.
That's so important. And what you were saying is that we don't always realize that, well, one of the other things that's in that book, Story or Die, is that we also tend to think as humans that everybody is probably pretty much like us.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's very important that we remember that if we are the kinds of people who either write down fiction stories or create a story to make something in nonfiction like interesting and helpful to somebody else, we have to remind ourselves that we are one of a small portion of people who do this well, and that what we are helping people to do is learn empathy themselves about situations that they haven't experienced before. But maybe then later they can say, oh, you know what? Whether I remember where I got this idea or not, I think what my best friend needs right now is just somebody to come alongside, even if we just sit there and stare at a painting and drink coffee.
Let's use grief as an example again, grief or loss, because they are so closely tied together. It doesn't have to be the loss of a loved one, but grief or very heavy loss. We will find usually in the same scene that there will be somebody who will be the person to say, okay, go get a rag, like with spilled milk, go get a rag. And another one will say, okay, move your glass away from the edge of the table so that that doesn't happen again. And then another person within the same family even may put their arm around the child who spilled the milk and say, oh, honey, I'm so sorry. It's going to be okay. We'll take care of it. And a fourth person maybe who will begin immediately to write a list of ways to prevent this from the future, or we're going to have a family meeting to talk about how not to spill your milk. So, and within life, it's like that as well. There are mama dies or daddy dies. One person is going to run to the kitchen and start doing dishes because she needs to be alone and she needs to process alone. And another person will say, I cannot be alone. I have to have people around me. Let's talk about the funny things about when mama died. And another person still is going to go shovel the snow out of the driveway so that other visiting relatives can come in. Everybody will have a role. I remember distinctly regarding that when my father passed away, and this isn't all about grief, but it's a strong emotion. So we know if we talk about that, we can extrapolate that to other emotions that we might feel.
Yeah.
But when my father passed away, it was in the middle of a blinding, cold, bitter snowstorm, blizzard, ice storm as well. And several things happened just in that time that were so incredible to us as a family. Yep, there was laughter going on in the living room. My not yet sister-in-law showed up at the house and made herself in charge of the kitchen because none of us could face it. And when we saw that happen, we said to our brother, keep her. Because she knows how to minister to a family in grief right now. We couldn't handle logging in all the casseroles coming to the door, but she did, so we could give good thank you notes out later. But there was we looked out, not everybody at the family had arrived yet. We looked out into the snowstorm, and you can imagine what a street light at the end of our driveway would have looked like in that kind of blowing snow with kind of a pinkish yellow glow, and you could barely see even the street light. And here's the 9-year-old neighbor boy knee deep in snow at the end of the driveway, keeping the driveway open so other family members could come in. So even in that picture, I was seeing everybody reacts differently. Everybody has a role. So as we write, we don't just write our own personality.
Yeah.
We write other personalities into the story too. Not everybody is going to be brave.
Yeah.
When the dragon shows up on the scene, but not everybody is going to flee either.
Right.
And somebody's going to write down the 3-point list of what we need to do next.
That's right. That's right. And you've got me thinking about all the kinds of books that I love to read, and several of which I like also to write, and all the different kinds of movies and TV shows I like. And I have to say that I love the sort of horror movies. I'm sure that there is a word for this genre, but
thriller,
it's not coming to me.
The ones
that are like satire, I guess like the satire horror movies, where you literally have all the different caricatures of characters, and all together it's hilarious.
Yes.
Because you do have the guy going, first we have to decide how many monsters are out there, how many axes do we have, how many choices do we have for exits, upstairs, downstairs, and everybody else is like, stop talking and run, and somebody else is So honestly, that can work for just about any kind of emotion or dramatic moment in any kind of genre, right?
Absolutely. Think of prairie romance. Think of the disasters that would happen on a prairie romance, any kind of them. And there's going to be a wide mix. If all the characters have the same kind of emotions and the same reactions, it's going to be a very dull story. Or it'll be a story about that kind of character all living together in the same community, which is a whole different thing.
That's a whole different kind of trouble.
So if we're studying neuroscience and if we're reading articles that are about how different personalities respond to different situations, if we're observing who in my family of 5 siblings, who is the one who's going to plan the baby shower, who's the one that's going to make the food, volunteer, I'll make twice the food as long as I don't have to plan, who's the person who's going to lead the games, and we always count on that person to lead games because the rest of us don't want anything to do with that. Who's the one who's going to volunteer for cleanup? You will find those members even within your own family or your circle of friends. We need each other because we fill in gaps for each other. The same thing will be true with either the characters in our books or the way we take a look at a nonfiction subject and how our readers also have different personalities. So are we making sure that within our nonfiction article or our nonfiction book, are we making sure that the way we're expressing it is going to be expressed for all those different kinds of people who are going to be reading it? They're not all going to be like you. And that's another key point for writers, is that when we're writing a book, it's not about us, the author. It's all about the reader. So even what words we use, or whether we decide to explain the word or not, or the way that we're expressing the emotion, or even in writing Facing the Dawn, I realized that there were going to be moms and wives who would have had a grief that is very raw and fresh. Why would I dare offer a book that does that and brings that all to mind? And one of the very reasons is to show different personalities reacting to the same kind of pain. Maybe that will help them to embrace how their children are reacting, or how their spouse is reacting, or how their friends are reacting, to make a complete whole picture of what people go through when there's great loss.
That's a good point. I've noticed that also in your book, that both of the other 2 kids in the family react differently, and then the best friend and the neighbor across the street, and I'm like, oh, I really like this. This is like every single person seems real because they seem just different enough from the other people, even though in another setting, like in a first draft for me, I would be worrying that all of my characters sound too much alike, because they're all in general nice people who want to help each other, and in my mind I'm like, oh, all these people are way too similar. But it's interesting. I think that maybe finding a book that you like, that you think to yourself, oh, all the characters are really different, even though they all obviously like fit together as a group, maybe is a good thing to kind of stop and think, take notes maybe when you're reading it, or go back to it and just ask yourself, how did all these people who, are maybe part of the same church or part of the same community, or for me,
all
like
teachers,
all of my groups, all teachers, all writers. But then how are all the people in this situation different enough? And then how can I make my people just different enough that it's even more interesting?
You might find too, all of us might find too, as we write, that we do certain things that are kind of similar in a lot of our books. What they talk often these days about, that the most appealing books are the ones where where the female lead character is strong, not necessarily the Victorian I have the vapors kind
Yeah.
of woman, but strong and brave and walk into whatever they're facing, because eventually we as writers came to realize, no, that is who we are at the core. That explains the Rosie the Riveters from the war.
Right.
Because when given the opportunity and when called upon, there's a deep, deep strength. And you'll see that in the pioneer women too, the real ones, as well as the ones that show up in books, that there is a deep strength that sometimes is allowed to be shown and sometimes not allowed to be shown. But what I find with my characters, when I look back at my books, almost every single one of the male lead characters, he has two key components to him. One is exceptional kindness and humor, at least some kind of sense of humor. I had a secondary character who had no sense of humor as the male. He was not the one that we want to keep on the pages all the time.
Yeah.
And of course, there are villains, and there are those people who act like villains or seem like they are, and then they turn out to be the answer in the end. But we as writers, it's okay for us to have a certain character quality that shows up in a lot of our books, but I have to be careful too that I don't make them look like the same character. I just give them a different name.
Right.
So what's different about them and how they respond, or what's their strength or weakness? So,
Yeah.
and we could talk about that kind of idea forever, because it's
Yes.
fascinating to talk about characters.
And we could probably kind of swing back around to what we talked about at the beginning, that a lot of it is just us actively paying attention. Like we notice things all the time, but to actively notice.
And record it, whether that's a slip of paper or in the notes app on our phone, or mentally record it somewhere. Feel the feels, allow yourself to feel somebody else's emotion about what just happened.
Yeah.
If a person who is near retirement age is laid off, and they may feel a freedom with that. They may feel like, well, it happened a little early and I think we're going to be okay financially. Not every person near retirement age is going to feel that same way.
Yeah.
So watching for how others are feeling is also going to help make us better people as human beings.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. The whole building empathy thing, which I think, I mean, I'm not sure, but I think that during a period when we can't physically be with other people very much, being aware of whether or not we're losing touch a little bit with how to be empathetic, I think is a good thing. I mean, I think so. I've been noticing it in myself, like watching church instead of going to church. So I'm no longer volunteering. Plus, I just happen to take on some work related things that have me working 6 days a week. So two more, something about I keep seeming to find churches where there's a whole lot of women in their 20s and 30s, and then there's these baby booms. So 2020 we had 8 babies, and the next 2 months we'll have 2 more babies, and so people want to cook for them and stuff. And I'm like, okay, hold on one second. If you need sugary sweets that taste like chocolate and something like that, I'm your girl. But if somebody's gluten or vegetarian, like there's nothing I can do. And and I'm not going to go there and see them. So I'm not going to hug them. I'm not talking to them. So I'm noticing that that I'm beginning to ask myself, am I pulling away from being a part of this community? Or do I need to do anything else to make sure that I continue to stay involved in this community in a way that is healthy and growth oriented and, things like that. Anyway, and maybe not all writers like sit around thinking about all these things in their mind. I have no idea if anybody else does. Tell me, do you, Cynthia?
Yes, I do.
Good, I'm not the only one.
And in fact, that yesterday, we're recording this on a Monday. So yesterday, I was feeling that we had like 30 below plus a wind chill factor, something.
Wow.
So we were colder than the North Pole yesterday. So we opted, because we live out in the middle of nowhere, to not travel to church, because we do have an in-person service that's masked and everything at the moment, and everybody will know what we're talking about when we say that. But for any kind of situation like that, whether you're home with an illness, or you're home with that there's a new baby in the house or something, that virtual worship service is a wonderful thing. I found myself, instead of just consuming it, I was going to need to get involved even during the service. So along the side, it's shown through Facebook live streaming, I made sure that I was commenting either to other people who were watching, or to the pastors when they'd eventually get to see it, or the worship team, or something, and just taking the effort to not just be entertained by it, but take notes, and then do the making those comments was keeping me a little bit more connected. But I'm missing the hugs.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of what are the unique things. And this is where the creativity has to come out in our living as well as our writing, is where are the things that I can make that connection difference? One of the things that is so typical about writers is that we like to lock ourselves in a room by ourselves and be with just our keyboard and our thoughts.
Yeah.
And the story that we're working on, or the nonfiction project that just has consumed us. And it's real easy after a while to not have coffee with a friend. Let's pretend that that's possible. Not have coffee with a friend because we're on deadline, or not experience life. What are we going to write about then? If we have distanced ourselves from people, if we have felt that my problems are so huge, I cannot involve myself in anybody else's problem right now, then we're losing exactly the tools we need in order to be able to write well. So somehow we need to find a balance there to be able to accomplish that.
I love that. And I'm guessing that is not something that we can be prescriptive with. People are going to have to ask themselves, how can I add more balance?
Yeah. What's my role in this? What do I have the bandwidth for?
Yeah.
And it may not be making the casserole, but it may be something else. And we are gifted with words, but sometimes we fail to realize how our use of words to touch one person may be the thing that is our shining moment in our whole writing career, as opposed to a book that wins lots of awards. But it's that note that we sent to the elderly woman who has been unable to get out of her house for a year and a half. Or more than that, or is caregiving for a sick spouse. And that note that we send with the words that we've been given may be our shining moment as a writer.
Yeah. And that would be so worth it. The tagline to my podcast and my teaching is write a book and change the world. And I absolutely believe that it's worth the time to write something, whether it's a book or anything else, that changes somebody's life. That all
or
of the
their
time.
moment, their moment, change a moment for them. Yes.
Exactly. I love it. I get so inspired when I'm talking to other people who are like, yes. Let's make people's lives better, even if it is just for a moment.
So true.
Cynthia, all right, we have to talk more because among other things, you're also an agent. So we'll have to have you back on the show talking about life and writing and publishing from that perspective as well.
I would love to do that. I would be honored, and it would be a great joy.
Awesome. But today you are here as Cynthia Ruchti. Did I say your name right?
That's it.
The author. So Facing the Dawn is the newest book. Tell us, where can people find you online, in bookstores, etc.? Where should they go to look for you?
The easiest place probably is to go to my website, which is cynthiaruchti.com. But the name is hard to spell. So they can also go to hemmedinhope.com. Reconnecting.com. Those are easier words to spell. That'll
Yeah.
take them to the very same website.
Ah,
And I'm on social media, most social media places I'm on there just as Cynthia Ruchti. Ruchti is spelled Ruchti for those who don't know. And the Hemmed in Hope website is because my tagline is I can't unravel, I'm hemmed in hope. So if they go
aw.
to the Hemmed in Hope website, they'll find all the books there. There are links to places where they can purchase if they choose to. And it's a joy. It's truly a joy to be able to connect with readers, but to connect with other writers too.
Excellent. Oh, good. I'm so excited. Thanks for giving us all that information, and thank you for saying that you like connecting with writers. Sometimes we think, "Oh man, I'd really like to talk to that person more." Or just send them an email and tell them how my book got so much better after this piece of advice. But no, they're probably busy. But that is nobody's too busy to get an email from somebody who was like, "That was really great what you did to help me," right?
Absolutely. It means a lot. And sometimes it's just that one little nugget, but it's going to make all the difference.
That's right. Ah, great having you on the show. Thank you so much for taking the time and your big book tour online. And we really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. If I could just say one last word, one final word to the writers out there, keep writing, keep trusting, keep growing, keep listening, and stay hemmed in hope.